All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. My name is Anna Wager, and I'm on the board of the William Morris Society. And on behalf of all of us and the programming committee in particular, I want to welcome you to this event where we'll be hearing from Rowan Bain and Rose Sinclair, the co-curators of the exhibition Althea McNish, Color is Mine. And to start us off, I would again encourage folks who perhaps do not belong to the William Morris Society in the US to consider joining us. So I'm going to post a link to do that in the chat right now. There are lots of benefits to doing so. You do not have to live in the US to be a member as well. We welcome folks from all over the world. And in addition, we have two upcoming events that I want to make you aware of as well. On February 15th, for folks who are in the New York City area, we are sponsoring a panel at the College Art Association conference at 4:30 p.m. And I will post a link to that in the chat momentarily as well. That one is an in-person event, so that is for folks who will be around in person. We also will be hosting a book talk virtually on February 24th. Which is a conversation between Andrea Wolk-Rager for her book, The Radical Vision of Edward Burne-Jones, and John Holmes for his book, The Temple of Science, The Pre-Raphaelites and Oxford University Museum of Natural History, both of which are amazing additions to the art historical discourse. And we are co-sponsoring that with the Historic Interiors affiliate group. And I'll post that link there momentarily as well. I'm now going to turn things over to Imogen Hart, who's going to introduce our speakers and get us started.
Thank you, Anna. Welcome, everybody. So just a little bit about the format of the event. So we will have a presentation from our speakers first. Well, they will tell us about the exhibition and about the artist that the exhibition focuses on, Althea McNish. And then we will have a conversation, and that will start out with a conversation with Anna and myself, and then we will open it up to you, the audience, for questions. So if any questions come to mind, and we really hope that you will share your questions, just put them in the chat, and then we'll sift through and pull those questions out of the chat and invite you to ask your questions of the speakers. And just a few house rules. Please keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking to the rest of the group. And without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. I'm not going to put a full bio in, I'm not going to present a full bio of both of them. I will put those in the chat so that you can see the details about our distinguished speakers. But I do just want to tell you who they are. Both of our speakers are based in the UK, so this is a great opportunity for us to link our William Morris Society in the United States with colleagues working on related issues here in the UK. So Rowan Bain is Principal Curator of the William Morris Gallery, London, where the Althea McNish exhibition opened last year. And Rose Sinclair is a lecturer in design and design education at Goldsmiths, University of London. And we are really grateful to both of you for joining us today, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, so for those of you that are with us today, Althea McNish was born in Trinidad in 1924. She was a member of the, she grew up in Port of Spain and came to art at a very early age. So for those of you that don't know, Trinidad was a English, it was an English colony, so a colonial space. So Althea herself, in order to gain a advanced art education, had to migrate to England. So in that kind of circumstance, we have to recognize that her more formal art education, thank you, art as a process or art within the space of Trinidad emerged for Althea through the Trinidadian Art Society, where she at an early age was taken up by artists such as Sybil Atek and MP Aladdin, who would go on to be kind of the great kind of arbiters of art within Trinidad. And she herself said that she could paint and draw before she could even write. And it was one of the things that her love of painting never went away. And the work that you see in her textiles and in her work is, she said that she took her painting into textiles, and it's testament to the work that we see today that her textiles have this painterly quality, but more than that, it's this innate experience that she has of the use of color that we see in her work, and it's this knowledge that she has of this. Her work, as I would probably say, shows no fear. And that's
Rose,
what
can you just confirm? Rose, can you just confirm you can see the presentation? I can't see anything.
Yes, sorry. Yes, we can. We can.
Okay.
We're on the screen, which shows Althea McNish,
Right.
born in Trinidad.
Right. Okay. So thank you for bearing with us. So this is the William Morris Gallery. For anybody that doesn't know, it's based in Walthamstow in East London, where William Morris lived as a teenager. The gallery's been open since the 1950s. And 10 years ago, we had a refurbishment, which saw an extension on the side, which allows us to do exhibitions. Now, we do exhibitions really that relate in some way to William Morris. And obviously, as most of you, all of you will all know, that's not too hard to find things that Morris was interested in, because he had such a wide range of interests and obviously professional skills. So we decided to do this exhibition in around 2018, 2019. And the parallels with Morris and Althea McNish they were incredibly interesting, and something that we really wanted to bring out in the exhibition. And we'll talk a bit about that later on. But that's just a bit of context for why the exhibition was in the gallery. Now, Rose, I'll pass you over to you.
Yes. So for those of you that don't know, Trinidad is just off the coast of Venezuela. It's one of the major Caribbean islands. But it's also one of the islands with the oldest cultural heritage in terms of art. It's the Trinidadian Art Society celebrates its 75th anniversary this year. And so it's really seminal that we're also looking at the work of Althea McNish, who they regard as one of their greatest kind of textile designers, but also the fact that she became one of the first. She's regarded as one of the first Black British designers to actually gain international recognition for her textile designs. So it's really important that we recognise the kind of the context from which she came and how she became established as an international designer of note and who she designed for. But we also had to recognise that the islands themselves, the Caribbean islands themselves, did not have a national art school or art place in the 1950s. This didn't emerge until well after independence in the 1960s with the development of the art schools in Jamaica, with the Edna Malley art schools in Jamaica in the 1960s. So Althea, like I said earlier, Althea, to get that formal art education, she actually came to Britain in end of 1950 on a scholarship to do architecture, and she said, "No, I'm not going to do that one, that's a man's job," and ended up transferring to the London School of Printing to do a course in what we call commercial printing now, and from that went on to do textiles. Over to you.
So throughout this presentation, we're going to show you some photographs of the actual exhibition. So here, the exhibition started with rooting Althea in Trinidad, and that was really important for us, to show her as not just a creative person in London in the 50s and 60s, but actually show how her creativity started with her early life in Trinidad. So I should say that a lot of the material that was in the exhibition came from Althea herself. Unfortunately, she wasn't alive when we opened the show, but her family were generously loaned a lot of material to the show. So we had access to quite personal items. So here on the screen, you can see some paintings that she did, probably actually when she was in London, but of memories of home back in Trinidad. So rural life in Trinidad. So the first one, a man cutting down a tree, women washing water clothes in the river, and on the far right, a painting that depicts a Muslim celebration in Trinidad. And that was very important for us to show how Trinidad's a very diverse country with lots of different people living in it, and how Althea would have been exposed to many different cultures and traditions and religious traditions. We then moved on to her, obviously, as Rose said, her artistic education, and then going into her first designs for different companies. So Rose, do you want to talk about Hull Traders and maybe Liberty and Hull Traders?
So what we see here is kind of the exhibition space, and the first one of her first design, just peeping out of the corner here, is Marina for Liberties. And what you can see going around the room are her key Liberty designs. So we've got hibiscus, eulalia, chabolus, and then we've got Hull Traders Golden Harvest, which is her most famous design. We see the blue version here. Hull Traders, we know that this was created in 1957, and she showcased it in her degree show in 1958. But it would go on to be Hull Traders' best-selling design for over 20 years. And it's probably the orange one, which we'll show you in a bit, is probably the one that everybody recognizes as her signature design here, reminiscent of a visit to one of her tutors and her mentor, Edward Bowden, in Essex, in southeast England, where she'd seen wheat fields for the first time and the sun rising. And for her, she said it was reminiscent of seeing the sugarcane fields in Trinidad. And then she kind of just sat and drew and came up with this amazing design. And one of the things Althea always did, she always did the designs in 4 or 5 colorways, because she said people needed to have choice. But when you look at the complexity of the design as a printer, and we see this kind of emulated through the way that William Morris worked with this complexity of layering. And one of the things that Althea did, she had this complexity of layering in the way that she used colors and the way that she used designs. And one of the things that we know that from looking at her designs, lots of her designs could have up to 15, 16 or 17 colors. We've seen some designs up to 24 colors layered in them. But the interesting thing about Golden Harvest was that the black that you can see as the top color, for those of you that know how screen printing works, this was actually drawn directly on the screen. It wasn't done through the normal coda trace process. So it almost looks like the wheat is actually blowing in the wind. So to get that kind of sgraffito effect, she actually drew that design directly onto the screen. So it has a different kind of visceral, almost effect on the screen itself. And luckily in the actual show at the Whitworth, we actually have the original strike off with the design.
This is Althea's first design for Liberty, which was designed in 1957. And it's called Marina. It's a bit different, actually. The colorway is quite dark compared to some of her better known patterns. So it's quite interesting to see, but it also has that handprint that of signature style of Althea that Rose has talked about, that kind of expressiveness to her design. The significance to Althea of Liberty was really, it's the company that launched her career. So when she graduated from the Royal College of Art, it was around a week later that she actually got a meeting with the chairman of Liberty, Stuart Arthur Liberty, which is unusual in itself for a graduate to get a meeting with such a high level person. And she got this meeting, and he was so struck by her use of colour that he realised in her it was kind of the perfect designer for the time. But post-war Britain, people were kind of craving optimism and light and colour. And when Althea came in with her designs, I think he saw in her this kind of perfect designer for the time. And he kind of took her on straight away, and they commissioned her very early on and took some of her degree show work and printed it for Liberty. But he also sent her in a cab that same day to another very important designer called fabric producer called Zika Asher, who was producing very high-end fabric for couturier like Dior and Balenciaga. And he also that same day commissioned Althea to design for him. So in this day, she had this incredible launch of her career, and from that moment on, she was really set. So it's really amazing to have found this very early design by Althea and have it in the show. And we actually found it on eBay, and it was unattributed, so we were very lucky to have this and to find it. And that was the thing about Althea, that so much of her work isn't known and isn't attributed, and that's what we found in the show, is and which thankfully kind of hopefully will change and bring her name out. Rose, do you want to talk about these other designs for whole traders?
Yeah. So what we see here, we see this lovely the pink piece that you see here is called Painted Desert, and next to it is the actual monoprint that was from that's from the V&A print archives. And also we see the design Rubra and Van Gogh, which are based on her periods in Paris. So Althea spent some time in Paris going around the museums, and she was very much inspired by the Impressionist paintings. And so we see that kind of inspired drawn work. And what we need to realize is that in 1954, she actually won, she was actually presented with the prize for one of the best students in terms of drawing in London School of Printing at that in 1954. So we can see that her drawing technique comes out in her artwork. And one of the things that she learned about when she was moving into kind of the furnishing designs, as you can see in the monoprint, her designs, I mean, this is bigger than A3. And her designs on paper are really, really large. What she had to learn in terms of her design work was how she had to rescale her work from her really large kind of almost elephant size sketches into putting things into a manageable repeat size. And she said for her, she started to learn scale. But what we also have to think about is, I think in the exhibition, one of the things that we learned really early on about her work was that it was a lot of the postmodern design was to fit in with the postmodern building work that was happening in Britain after the war. So a lot of new buildings were being built, lots of homes had large windows, they had to use light, and also the designs had to be dramatic. And so lots of Althea's work hit that dramatic space. So they were, and if you think about it, it's almost like walking into, I call a lot of her work walking into a cathedral. So the work was dramatic in color, dramatic in scale, dramatic in its approach, but also she drew on nature a lot for her her inspiration. So you can see this mishmash of color, but also she was homesick. So her reference points tended to be either the English countryside, where she could look at the flowers that reminded her of back home, or her reference books and of cards that she would always bring back with her whenever she went back home to Trinidad. And we see that reference now in her paintings, in reference in the textile, sorry. So the previous one that Rowan just showed was Carried by Heels, and then we just saw a different kind of approach in Tommy by Dinah.
Sorry, it's got the wrong credit, but it should say, yeah, Tomei.
This is Tomei by Dinasco, which again has a different feel, but a lot of Althea's work, again in 1959, 1960, was also based on abstraction. So she would take images and almost repurpose them in terms of using her approaches to abstraction. Things where she also used black a lot, and she said she uses black because it has power in it, and she had this thing about how she would use different types of color and how she would layer color.
So we thought the amazing thing about Althea was that before she died, she was actually filmed by the BBC. So we thought it'd be really nice to show you a clip of herself talking. And you can note in the background that she's surrounded by the textiles, and some of the things that you see in the film behind her were actually in the show. So I will. So that's a lovely insight, and
this meeting is being recorded.
So this is a lovely insight, I think, into Althea, and I think it raises some questions that people had about the show. Of course, like, why is she not better known? I think there's lots of reasons for that. Partly, obviously, she talks about being a Black woman in a very white male-dominated world. She's also hugely prolific and was working away professionally, producing, and didn't put herself in the same kind of limelight that, say, someone like Zandra Rhodes did. She was working, teaching, and as her family said, I think they said that she just didn't have time to kind of promote herself in that way. Of course, her designs were everywhere, and she obviously deserved to have more recognition in her lifetime. But there's, yes, lots of questions about why she wasn't better known. Do you want to say a bit more about that, Rose?
Yeah, so when we look at her career, it spanned over 60 years. And one of the things was she never worked for a company. She was never employed by a company. She was always freelance. And the research for this project, this work has also emerged from a research project. And the thing that we're finding out consistently is that she did work with Curators for over 10 years. She did work with Liberties for over 20 years. She did work with Cavendish Textiles, which is part of John Lewis's. We've now found out over 20 years. She was always working for companies for long periods of time and she was aware of trends. She was always forthcoming in terms of her technological approach. And one thing that we've noticed, and I think Rowan will agree, we've never seen her designs copied. She said one design was copied, which was Theodoric, which was a print design, but we've never seen her designs ever copied anywhere. And I think that's because they were too difficult to copy, because of this innate layering and multifaceted aspects of her work. But I think, and we've said this, we ask this constantly, has there ever been a book about her? Has there ever been, where can we find more information? And we've scoured numerous publications and only ever been able to find snippets about her. So we think that the fact that she's never had this this broad range of context written about her boils back down to the fact that she didn't do all of this self-promotion, but she was known within the industry.
I'm just going to show you, I'm going to kind of race through a few pictures because I think I'm conscious of time and people will have questions. So the show at the gallery spread itself out throughout the different rooms, and here you can see kind of moving out away from her large print designs, textile designs, and looking at more of her designs for fashion. So here in the middle you've got some of her silk scarves. Behind that, her designs for working with plastic. We also looked at some of her paper fashion and also her paintings as well. She designed 4 interiors, and this is murals that she designed for the cruise liners for P&O. So these incredible plastic laminated murals. We touched on Carnival as well. So this is from her own archive, that she was very involved, obviously coming from Trinidad, in Carnival, and brought Carnival costumes to London as well for a very large interior design show called the Ideal Home Show, which was televised across the country. And she was did the central feature of this exhibition and bringing Trinidad Carnival costume. And another thing we did for the show at the gallery was commission 2 architects called Studio Nali to reinterpret the Bachelor Girl room, which was designed for another Ideal Home exhibition, which was the idea that you had a room for a single female and how they would live in this room. So she designed this room for the Ideal Home exhibition, and you can see the orange curtains on the right were actually the ones that she used, and the contemporary designers reimagined this for the 21st century of what a single woman living in a kind of urban environment their home might be, and how they might need furniture that could be taken apart and moved around, and how the function of textiles also means that you can take curtains or fabric down and move it to another space if you're moving around. We'll talk about this in the talk a bit, I think, but this was part of the exhibition. We worked with Liberty to reissue some of Althea's original designs, and this is some of the range that was produced and you could buy from Liberty. And here we can see the show that's moved to Manchester, to the Whitworth Art Gallery, and it's been an amazing opportunity to show even more of Althea's work. There's much bigger spaces, and we were able to kind of go back to the family's collection and bring out even more. Rose, do you want to say anything about this?
Yeah, the what we were able to do with this exhibition was actually go back again and have another deep dive, as I call it, into the collection. And actually what we've been able to do is extend it with work from the Caribbean artist movement, more work that's also centrally based around the connections with like Eduardo Palazzi, Nigel Henderson, work from people like Vanley Burke, the photographer, Paul Dash, Ronald Moody, Errol Lloyd, Winston Branch, who actually showed with Althea as part of the Caribbean artist movement. So to bring and make those connections really strong. So if we think about it, Althea was showing alongside those artists, and now those artists are shown alongside Althea. So we're changing the context of how her artwork was important and installed. And here we're also able to showcase other fabrics. So if we look at this blue one here, Fresco, is actually for Cavendish Textiles. So we're showing not only the fabrics that she did for high-end stores such as Liberty's, Heels and Danasco, but also the everyday store, and Cavendish Textiles is part of John Lewis's. So this notion that Althea's fabrics were also part of a broader consumer market. And so her styling was moving not only across from the high end, but also into the everyday home. So this notion that her work was actually, I would say, subverting the way in which we think about practice and process. And if you see on here, the Danasco print, so we think that Althea was always doing these figurative nature prints, but actually she was also doing what I call these also almost Scandi type prints as well. These ones which are not figurative, but very kind of based on her innate use of colour. And we were also able to draw out more of her wallpapers and also woven fabrics that she designed in the 80s for British Rail and carpet. So we were able to show the extent, if you like, of her textile collection, which we'd not been able to show before. And we were able to showcase her broadening influence as well on designers, and also her work with companies. So this piece here is really interesting. It's with a company called Fedicetti in Italy, and we see
you say the ones on the left to everyone because they can't see.
Sorry, the ones on the left, and it shows her at the. This was designed at the same time we see her going back into painting and painting large canvases, and you can see that painterly effect coming back into play. But we also were able to pick up on designers that had been influenced by her work. So we met a designer called Leslie Wills, who had been influenced by Althea way back in the 70s, who had designed for heels as well, who was of Guyanese heritage. So we see this kind of to and fro of Althea's influence on the wider design perspectives.
And Leslie's work is the one on the far right, so the jacket and the dark blue and orange work at the end. So we'll have a little chat about this in a minute, but I just want to keep these pictures in mind. These will be familiar to William Morris fans, African Marigold and Honeysuckle, but we'll come back to these because that is interesting. There's lots of quotes, weren't there, Rose, that we were able to pick out. She had some amazing things that we could bring out about herself.
Yeah, so one of the things we wanted to keep was her voice throughout the exhibition. So we used key quotes throughout that would engage people, because obviously Althea's not here. And one of the things that we wanted to keep share with you today was this notion of her experimentation and her sense of technology, and that she just didn't want to just paint pictures, but she wanted her ideas to go further than that. And I think inherent in all her textiles is both her love of painting, but also what you could do with technology and how you could extend it. And I think that's where that correlation with William Morris comes in. And each of these works, so for instance, this one on Frangipani, which was for whole traders, she kept even her screens in her archive. So the fact that we can look at one of her silk screens and start to analyze her approach to printing, and trying to dissect that, even on Frangipan, there's like 18 colors layered in this design. So you can imagine a screen that's almost 3 foot tall, and then trying to think that was 16 screens, or that Lumiere here, which was on the right, which was used for the Ideal Home exhibition, that's a 12 color screen. And Fresco, which I actually had a chance to look at in the John Lewis archive a couple of days ago, that's a 12 color screen. So it's this, what I call this technical acuity that she has of being able to play with color and then have this translated into these amazing prints. But today you couldn't do that. There was no company that will allow you to do 12, 15, 20 color screens, because that would be almost commercially unviable. It would probably be done as a digital print, but not as a screen print. And finally, this notion of, I think we alluded to it earlier, that she went back into painting, but also she was one of her and her husband John in the beginning of the 1980s were the first art. They were looking at computer aided design in the 1980s, using a TV screen to actually use as the design monitor, and then photographing the TV screen and then printing it off. So she was into technology right at an early stage, and by then she was in her 70s. So we're looking at a woman who thought that technology could give you the creativity. If you knew the technology, you could be creative. And that has this similarity to William Morris, in that he utilized technology to enable creativity.
So I think we're going to pass back to Imogen. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Rose and Rowan, for taking us through the project, through Althea's work, through both the exhibitions. It was very tantalizing to see the images of the Manchester installation. I will invite everyone to be thinking about some questions, and please post them in the chat. And while you're thinking about them, I like to kick off by picking up the last point that you made about relationship between Althea McNish's work and that of William Morris. Did you, I think you mentioned right at the beginning, Rowan, that you really wanted to highlight artists who had a relationship with William Morris in some way, and I would love to hear you say a bit more about what you see that connection as being, in addition to what Rose has just been saying about the importance of technology. But also, did you ever, in all your deep research and your conversations with the artist, did you ever hear her talk about Victorian design? Did you ever hear her mention William Morris, what some of her textile design influences might have been? I think we'd just be interested to hear more about that. Anything you'd like to share with us?
Yeah. So for obviously coming from, you know, my Morris centric world, I think for me the parallels between Morris and Althea were really kind of obvious, but also not. So obvious in that they're both interpreting nature, and particularly the British countryside, in innovative ways and using it for textiles and for wallpapers. So there's obviously the similarity of just what they're doing and what they're looking at. A really incredible sense of colour, and that's something that they both understood, had deep understandings of. And then, as Rose says, this technical understanding that Althea understood in the same way that Morris knew that if you knew how to make things, you could break the rules. And that's something that I think Althea and both Morris had in common. So that's a kind of starting point and really interesting. But also, I think we were really conscious that you don't want to obviously slavishly say that everything goes back to William Morris. And Althea deserves to be recognised in her own right as a female designer, and for all those reasons, and not just because she's like a follower of Morris. She should be seen in her own right, and that's really important. So we didn't say it in the exhibition that these are the parallels, but we hoped that people would pick that up just from being it. There's also an interesting thing of just where they were. So Althea lived about 2 miles from the gallery. So we kind of thought she must have visited the William Morris Gallery at some point. She must have known about it. It was virtually her nearest museum. And when we went through the archive, we did find a reference to patterns by William Morris, and also links to object numbers in the V&A, which were William Morris textiles. So that was the kind of, oh great, we've got this evidence that we knew. And obviously, you know, as a textile designer, who wouldn't have known William Morris? But, you know, that was really amazing to find this sort of proof, I guess. But then subsequently, our relationship with Liberty has been really interesting. And the archivist there has discovered evidence that Althea McNish recoloured African marigold and honeysuckle. So the slide that I showed you, she recoloured that for Liberty in the 1960s. So there's an amazing, you know, established link that Althea actually used her sense of colour to make, you know, William Morris popular again in the 1960s through these textiles. And we actually have both those textiles by coincidence in our collection, so it's incredible. And Rose, the other day when you were at John Lewis's archive, you also found reference to those things. So it's growing, our understanding of that.
Oh, Rose, I'd love to ask, what did you find? What was Rowan was just saying about, you found something in the John Lewis archive that made a similar connection to either to Morris?
So in the John Lewis archive, they've actually got original designs from the that were that were reprinted. They've got the second design that William Morris ever printed in the John Lewis archive that have just been redone for Kelmscott. Is it Kelmscott House? Have I got that
Manor.
right?
Yeah,
Kelmscott
Manor.
Manor.
Yeah.
So they've just reprinted the beds, the 4-poster bed that's in Kelmscott Manor, and they found that they had the original design in the archive at John Lewis, because it was part of the Steed McAlpine archive, and they found the original print, so they've just reprinted it. And they were going through the different print books. I was able to see the original print that they've got. So they've got a whole back catalogue of the prints, and they were saying that so I was texting Rowan at the same time saying, look, I've just seen these amazing prints here that they've got at John Lewis archive. So they've got a whole body of work.
Someone in the chat's asked, we weren't able to put those in the exhibition because the research that actually came out after we'd opened. Classic, obviously. You find these things out, but that's one of the good things about showing people work, is then you get to discover new things. So we weren't able to show it in the show, but they are actually now going to go to, there's a show in Milan on Liberty, and those two pieces have been selected, so they will go on display, but not in England, in Milan. So
we have got some questions. Sorry, go ahead, please go ahead, Rose.
I was going to say, in terms of Althea ever talking about William Morris, she didn't talk to me about William Morris, but she did talk a lot about why she used colour and how she used colour and why she worked the way that she did. So it was primarily because she said that's what she had to do. That was her work in life, and she just loved to just do drawing and textiles, and she always carried a sketchbook wherever she travels. So one of the things that we were lucky to find in her archive was these myriad of sketchbooks, and she always, on holiday, she and her husband John would actually drive through Europe, and all of her sketchbooks show when she would stop and she would be drawing all these pictures all around Europe or a museum. And so these are, she has an amazing archive of work, and we have in both exhibitions showed excerpts from her sketchbooks.
I guess worth mentioning, I think, is if you want to look at the differences between her and Morris. And I think one of the things I feel is that she uses kind of motifs that don't connect. So some she uses kind of repeating, connecting patterns, but there's a lot where you just have a kind of a solo flower, in the same way maybe like Daisy, I guess. But Morris didn't do that much, where you just have this one plant motif. And also the use, as Rose referred to as well, of black, and her confidence with the colour black, and that's obviously very different and very marked in Althea's work, that she has this very sketchy quality. But I think it's also interesting that I just was thinking when Rose was talking about how, when you look at Morris's design work, how he's working things out on the page and kind of figuring it out. And I think that's also an element to Althea that you see if she's drawing on the screen printing, that she's kind of using that design process to work things out and be experimental, and that gives life to her work as well.
This is such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much. We have some questions in from some of the audience members, so we can bring those in. Please keep adding questions if you have them to the chat. So Jude Nixon, would you like to ask your own question, Jude? Rather than me reading it? I'll read it, okay. Jude asks, what qualities make her work endemically Caribbean other than her actual subjects, like some of her landscape pieces?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the question.
He asks, what qualities make her work endemically Caribbean other than her actual subjects, like some of her landscape pieces?
I don't think her work is endemically Caribbean. I think it has a I think what she does really, really brilliantly is merge two cultures together. I think she realized that she took her Caribbean heritage and what she said her adopted heritage from England, and she merges these together. Because if you look at her work when she's drawing floral arrangements, for instance, she takes like the daisy, for instance, and she doesn't just keep it as this little miniature flower. She explodes it. So we see that in the image of Rubra, for instance. That's a daisy that she's taken and she's exploded, and it becomes this really majestic flower, and it's almost unrecognizable. And what she does with kind of flora and fauna is that she distorts them and she abstracts them, but she takes that color, that notion of color that she learned as a painter back in Trinidad, and she brings that. So she's not afraid of using color, and she was taught that when she was working with MP Aladdin and Sybil Attek and the painters, the painting influence that she learned in the Caribbean at a very early stage. She kept that. She never lost that sense of being afraid to use color. And I think one of the mistakes we can make is that because a person comes from a particular place, we can kind of think, well, that heritage means that you are Caribbean, your sense of color comes from that place. And she always had this label of it's her Caribbean sense of color, it's her tropical sense of color. And sometimes I think she played on that herself and said, well, I tropicalize things. She talks about that a lot in her work. She says, I tropicalize things, but that was also imposed on her, that she tropicalizes things. But what she did, she took that kind of sense of how you can rescale and resize and abstract things, and then she put her own take on things. And she would say, I am inspired from where I've come from, but I'm also inspired by, I'm not afraid to use color. I hope that answers your question.
Jude says yes. Thanks, Rose. I have some questions for you about the exhibition and about the process of planning the exhibition. As co-curators, can you tell us a bit about how you work together, your collaborative process, and also some of the challenges that you encountered in installing the exhibition, given that these are textiles? Were there some different techniques you tried for installing that didn't work, that you thought, okay, we'll try something different? Like anything that any insights you can share about that process?
I mean, given that we planned this exhibition 2018, 2019, and we were originally going to have it in 2020, I can say, obviously, the show is totally different to how we envisioned it would be. So, for one thing, Althea died in the middle. That she died in 2020. Obviously, the pandemic, everything around that. So the process, when we first envisioned it, I think we thought this was an incredible idea. And Rose had come to the gallery to give a talk and mentioned about Althea and said she was giving a talk at a local museum. So I went along to see it. And was kind of bowled away by the kind of information and the images presented, and was kind of amazed that no one had done a show on it. So we kind of approached Rose and said, let's work together on this. But we didn't really know what was going to be in it. We knew that there was some textiles in some collections. So there's like a small amount in the V&As, a small amount in the Whitworth. We now know there is actually even more. But we didn't have access to Althea's actual personal collection, because at that point she was not well, and you couldn't access her collection because of her ill health. So it was only after, we kind of rethought the exhibition, came back together post kind of pandemic, knowing that we were actually going to be able to put this show on in 2022. We replanned dates, that actually the time allowed us to have access to a lot more material than we first anticipated. We always knew that we wanted to be quite visually layered with it. We knew we wanted to be quite bold with the textiles. In the end, I think even we didn't realize that we would have so much stuff, and that obviously led the way that the whole appearance of the exhibition. It was a very dense show. That's partly because of the space, but partly because the way her work looks, it looks really good when you can see it all together and you get that impression of all the colors. If we knew that we didn't want it to be shown in a kind of white room, we knew we wanted to be really bold with the way we displayed it. So the layering was a conscious choice to kind of show how her patterns related to each other and how the clashing colors, and really embrace that. And having things hanging from the ceiling, and having her designs. And that was also a really important thing for us, that it wasn't that we weren't just seeing, here's all the textiles, here's all these one type of thing. We wanted to show her design process throughout. So we wanted to show her original design drawings next to her textiles, so people could see her as her process and her actually as a designer, and then the finished fabric as well. And that was very important to us, that we weren't just showing her finished product all the time.
Yeah, I think for us, for me, one of the challenges was, I thought originally we were going to do something for 6 weeks, and then it turned out into a really long time. But I think one of the challenges, I think Rowan would agree, was actually doing the label writing, because there's been very few kind of exhibitions where you talk about a Caribbean designer in this kind of space, and actually writing the labels and making sure that it's her voice and it's getting the context right. And we did labor over the labels a lot, about getting the framing for them right. And I think that was, and the feedback from that has been really brilliant. People have engaged with the reading of the labels and get the story behind Althea, and that's what we wanted to do, to get that story about her right. And I think the challenge was what to leave out. Because we were then engaged with so much other stuff, it was what to leave out. And I think for the Whitworth, because we had much bigger space, it was the fact that we could then bring on board other aspects of other links of her work, such as the Caribbean artist movement and other aspects that we couldn't bring into the smaller space at the William Morris Gallery. But also, I think one of the things that I'm really proud that we were able to do was bring in the video, find all this different video footage, because that showed her in the 60s, in the 80s, but also how it also connected her as a person so people could actually see her work and her process and her practice. And the fact that for some of that video footage hadn't seen the light of day for 50 years. So for us, that was really part of that research. Part of the research process was finding stuff that had been in archives, or we were told, oh, it doesn't exist, and yet it meant a lot of foot slogging to get it.
But it also showed you that Althea was of interest to people, and was of interest to, and had been filmed as you know, for various TV programs. And there's a lot lost. There's a lot we know that was there, and she was interviewed for radio and talked about her practice. So she was noticed when she was alive, but it just didn't have this sort of sustained focus on her. And I think that's what kind of the show's been able to do. And in answer to someone else's question, Rose is now working on a book that will, bring all this research together. And so there will finally be a monograph on Althea, which is really exciting.
There's a question in the chat which kind of speaks to this moment where Althea is now becoming so much better known thanks to your exhibition. The question comes from Cheryl and Kurt, and it says, brightness and energy in this work seem to have the vibrancy people might long for in our current destabilized world. Are these designs catching on during this time?
So I mentioned that we had a relationship with Liberty during the show. So Liberty, we approached Liberty about reissuing her designs, and they were really keen. And it was they did a kind of capsule collection, and it sold out, which is incredible. The family, the issue with some of her actual designs is that the family now the estate own the copyright. And they are now, I think, trying to kind of formulate this interest and kind of capture this interest in her and see where they want to go with her collection now. So part of it of her actual designs is going to be, we'll see what the family want to do with it and what direction they do, but I know they have plans. But I think there's definitely going to be wider influence that we start to see as people are aware of her, and we'll start to see that, I guess, over the next year or so, as we'll be able to see people and people talking about, you know, having seen the show and having understood who she is and know about her. I think we'll definitely start to see that this coming in through textiles and textile design and fashion and interiors. I'm no doubt that we'll start to see lots of sunflowers and bright coloured things, and we'll be able to see that has the stamp of Althea. What do you think, Rose?
Yeah, I think what's starting to happen now, and I'm getting lots of inquiries from universities and colleges and saying, oh, can you come and speak? Or we've taken our students to see the show and they've been inspired, they want to know more about her. So I think there's also this notion of, yes, our students realise now that they need this return to drawing, or they're not afraid of colour, or the notion of layering, or they're going back into the screen printing room. So they're looking at the techniques that she used and seeing that you can explore colour, you can do layering, you need to know the technical to be able to explore the creativity. So there is this notion that they've understood that you have to spend time in the workshop and in the lab to then push the boundaries. So I think there is this, I think what she's shown is that that color is part of the printing process. It's not this monocolor space. It's this notion of, yes, you can use color, you can use layering, you can use complexity, but also you can start off with just exploring. One of the things that she used a lot was monoprinting. So she used the monoprint, I call it her form of photocopying, was this monoprinting approach that she had. So she used monoprints quite a lot as her starting point, and then would layer them with all this other multimedia. And if you look at all of her work, it all starts as a black and white monoprint 9 times out of 10, or she uses paint really well, or mixed media or inks, or even the simple Crayola wax crayon is her thing of choice. So she used all different media, and she wasn't afraid to use them to make her to whatever she was going to design.
I should just mention actually here about influence that I think she's starting to be included in shows as well. Lots of different exhibitions now, although our exhibition there's no immediate plans for it to tour again. I know that she's being represented in various shows, including a show which was in England at the same time as our show. It's called Life Between Islands, and it was put on by Tate, and it's actually touring to Toronto in the autumn, and Althea is included in that show, and they show quite a lot of her textiles. So for anybody around that area in the autumn, I'd definitely recommend going to see that exhibition, because it's incredible survey of Caribbean artists, and yeah, it's a really interesting show. So and you can see some Althea in real life.
Yeah, so I think what you'll start to see is that, as Rose just said, you'll start to see her work coming through in various shows. I know there's like a piece of her work in the Cooper Hewitt. There's, I think, another one at the Philadelphia Museum, but there isn't a lot around in the States, I know. But it's just amazing that she's opened another door of people looking for her work and looking for those bits of information, if you like, that surround her work and what she's done. So I know that she did design woven fabrics, or she says in her archive notes she designed woven fabrics for Jack Larson, for instance. So it'd be interesting to see where those fabrics are, or one of her designs called Sura was showcased by Gustav Tassel, the designer who also designed garments for Jackie Kennedy. So there's this kind of notion that her designs were used in the States. So it's finding where all these things went. Her tentacles, her reach is far. She kind of says in her archive notes, well, I'm going to the States. I went to the States in October 66 or 69 or 62. So we know that she traveled to the States quite a lot. And it's just finding what she did when she was there.
And I think, as a way to kind of wrap us up, one of the things that's been super exciting about this talk and the Q&A is hearing about how the exhibition is really a launching off point, that there are a ton of questions that have been raised by your research and seeing where that moves in the future. So I wanted to give you both a little space to talk about, obviously we've been talking a lot about what this future project looks like for Rose, but if there's anything else either of you want to say about your upcoming projects or directions you'd like to see some of this moving in, that seems like a good way to wrap us up today.
I think in terms of the gallery, I think it's, in some ways, I think it was just, we were so fortunate to have this, and will we find another one like it? But yes, of course we will, because there's incredible designers that are underrepresented and haven't had the attention they deserve out there. Of course there is. So and I think for us it was an incredible chance to engage with our local communities, work with Rose, work with academics, bring in new expertise, and a really exciting way of working that we definitely will be continuing in the future. And we did a lot of community engagement with this. We did a lot of talks with Caribbean elders, and that's something that we will continue. And we, in our future program, we're very much like picking up on these ideas. So we've got a show in the summer called Ashish, who's a designer who works with he doesn't like this, but he's the king of sequins, and he is an Indian designer who works in Britain, has never had a survey of his work, so that's going to be an exhibition. And then going into forward, definitely looking at Morris and his international reach, and that's something that's really interesting. So we've got a show on Minge, Japanese arts and crafts next year, and also then looking at Morris and Islamic art and how Islamic art influenced his tradition and his design and pattern making. So maybe I'll come back and talk to you about that. But Rose, do you want to talk about the direction of this particular?
So for me, the direction of this will be to continue. Well, my next year is going to be filled with writing this book on Althea, which will be the first kind of major retrospective monograph on her work, and we're all being well, it will be published in time for her centenary next May, so that will be really exciting, and then I'll be hopefully doing some further research on her on some particular aspects of her work. I'm not quite sure which direction it's going to take me at the moment, but I'm still kind of currently just looking at more of her textiles, more of her kind of painting work, and just trying to understand a little bit more further breadth. But also, for those of you that don't know, I'm also very interested in Black women and community work, community groups such as the Dorcas Society. So and that's come out of my PhD. So I'm interested in how the links between kind of amateur Black community textile workers and professional Black textile workers, and where those fit together in the terms of textiles and how they connect. So I'm kind of looking at research work around that as well.
Brilliant. Thanks to both of you. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. Imogen, anything else?
No, just to echo your thanks, and we eagerly await the book, Rose, and the next exhibitions at the William Morris Gallery. Thanks everyone for being here.
Absolutely. Come back and tell us about all of these future things.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and have
Thanks.
a nice day or evening or
rest.
morning.
Bye-bye.
Yes.